This is part two of the video lecture on the English and Scottish Reformation. This video lecture is for the Church History 1 class at the East Asia School of Theology. One of the surprising things about the Scottish Reformation was the unexpected nature and speed the Protestant Reformation took in Scotland. At the beginning of the 16th century, Scotland was a very devout Catholic nation. None expected Scotland to go from being such a devout Catholic nation to becoming overwhelmingly Protestant, nor did any expect this to happen as suddenly as it did. The first Scottish Protestant martyr was Patrick Hamilton, who came from a wealthy family that grew wealthy from the fact that many of their men had important positions within the Catholic Church. Hamilton's family was also related to Scotland's king. Patrick, however, read Martin Luther's writing while he was a theology student in Paris and became attracted to Luther's views. He then became a professor at St. Andrews University in Scotland and wrote a book that was condemned as heretical and fled to Germany for a time, but returned to Scotland and began preaching the Protestant faith. James Beaton, who was the Archbishop of St. Andrews, summoned Patrick Hamilton for a debate, but upon arrival, Archbishop Beaton conducted a short theological of Patrick's teaching and ordered him arrested. So Archbishop Beaton told Patrick Hamilton that he wanted to debate him. Patrick Hamilton thought this was a wonderful opportunity to debate the Protestant religion with someone who might be open to hearing the truth, but it was actually a trap because after he was arrested, Patrick Hamilton was examined the following morning by a council of bishops on 13 teachings Patrick Hamilton had made. He was found guilty of heresy and he was sentenced to be executed that afternoon. Patrick Hamilton was burned at the stake, but it took him 6 agonizing hours to die. He was only 24 years old when he was executed. And all of this was unusual because normally heresy trials took weeks or even months to complete. But Patrick Hamilton's heresy trial took only hours, and then he was executed the very same day. So this was a most unusual trial and execution. Now, Archbishop Beaton intended for Patrick Hamilton's death to scare people away from Protestantism, but the Archbishop's actions backfired, and many Scots converted to Protestantism because of Hamilton's courageous stand and unflinching faithfulness during his death. Despite Patrick Hamilton's courageous example, the catalyst for the Scottish Reformation, like the English Reformation, can be found in the dynastic politics of Scotland's royal family. Upon the death of her father, James V of Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, became the focus of intense competition between France and England to find a suitable husband for her. France was Catholic, while England was Protestant. For many centuries, Scotland and England were enemies. For example, think of William Wallace's rebellion against the English rule as portrayed in the movie Braveheart. Due to this conflict, Scotland had historically sought an alliance with France, which was because France was England's permanent enemy. You know, you have that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, that proves the case here. So if you look at this map, which shows the different kingdoms of Europe in 1550, you'll find that England had Scotland to the north and France to the south. And so Scotland was allies with France, which meant that England faced enemies both to the north and the south. Mary of Guise, who was Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, was one of the regents of Scotland at that time, since Mary, Queen of Scots, was not yet old enough to assume responsibilities for ruling over Scotland. Mary of Guise began a systematic purge of Protestants throughout Scotland in 1545. At this time, George Wishart, an itinerant preacher, was preaching Protestant teachings throughout Scotland. Wishart was arrested in 1546 and burned at the stake by Archbishop Beaton. Shortly afterwards, Archbishop Beaton was savagely murdered at St. Andrew's Castle in retaliation by some of Wishart's followers, who then took control of St. Andrew's Castle, which then became a haven for Protestants. Now let's turn to John Knox. One of the central figures of the Scottish Reformation was John Knox. The date of John Knox's birth is uncertain, but we do know that he grew up in East Lothian, Scotland, and his mother died when he was young. He attended the University of St. Andrews and was ordained a Catholic priest in 1536. Knox was converted to Protestantism by Wishart sometime in 1543 or 1544, and soon became one of George Wishart's bodyguards. So John Knox accompanied the itinerant preacher around Scotland and protected George Wishart with a double-edged sword. Shortly before Wishart was arrested, Wishart urged Knox to flee. So in April 1547, John Knox arrived at St. Andrew's Castle, where he quickly became a chaplain. Mary of Guise persuaded the French to aid her against these hostile Protestants, and the French fleet successfully attacked St. Andrew's Castle in June 1547. The French captured those who surrendered, including John Knox. John Knox then spent 19 months as a galley slave, rowing every day aboard a French ship and surviving on meager rations. Following his release in early 1549, Knox went to England, where he became a licensed preacher in the Church of England. He quickly became a popular preacher in England and was soon appointed as a royal chaplain to King Edward VI of England. In the meantime, he had married a woman named Marguerite Bowes. And so this is a picture of St. Andrew's Castle in Scotland. And I chose this picture because you can see just how close this castle is to the water. And so the French fleet anchored off of St. Andrew's Castle and successfully captured this castle, and then captured all of those who surrendered, including John Knox. Following the death of Edward VI in 1553, John Knox fled England to escape persecution by Queen Mary. Knox sent his wife to her family in Scotland, while he fled to Geneva in Switzerland. And so if you look at this map, you can see Scotland to the north of England, which is where John Knox sent his wife so that she could be with her family. And then John Knox himself fled all the way to Geneva, which is located at the very western tip of Switzerland. During his time in Geneva, Knox became friends with John Calvin and was heavily influenced by Calvin's theology. At Calvin's urging, Knox pastored an English-speaking congregation in Frankfurt, Germany, until one of his writings against Queen Mary was discovered, and he was asked to leave. Knox then returned to Scotland. By this time, Protestantism had taken greater hold in Scotland, much to Knox's surprise. John Knox quickly became a celebrity preacher in Scotland and even wrote a letter to Mary of Guise in 1556, calling her to repent of her Catholic faith. Mary of Guise did not respond to this letter, but Knox was summoned to Edinburgh for a hearing. However, Knox showed up at this hearing with so many supporters that the hearing was called off. A short time later, John Knox left for Geneva again, answering a call to pastor his old congregation in Geneva. While he was in Geneva, John Knox wrote a treatise entitled The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, in which he denounced Queen Mary, Mary of Guise, and Mary, Queen of Scots, as abominations in the sight of God, and declaring his belief that the Bible prohibits women from ruling over men. When Queen Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth became the new Queen of England, and then many Protestants in Geneva decided to return to Britain and Scotland, including John Knox. However, Knox's return to Scotland was delayed because Queen Elizabeth I, who was none too thrilled by Knox's anti-women writings, denied him permission to travel through England. Upon arriving in Scotland, John Knox quickly became a political and spiritual force and worked with other Scottish Protestants to dethrone Mary of Guise. Elizabeth I set aside her personal dislike of Knox and sent British troops into Scotland in order to break France's hold on Scotland. Mary of Guise finally died in June 1560, and the French quickly withdrew from Scotland. John Knox then convened an assembly which established the Presbyterian Church of Scotland and adopted the Scots Confession for the new church. So we saw earlier how the 39 articles were adopted as the Confession of Faith for the Anglican Church. Well, the Scots Confession was adopted as the Confession of Faith for the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. Knox rejected the Anglican hierarchical structure and organized the Presbyterian Church to be headed by a presbytery, which was a board of elders who governed the church with the agreement of deacons and ministers. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland had no central figure like the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury, and granted full voting rights to all elders in good standing. In this, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland was remarkably democratic in structure. Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to Scotland in 1561 and announced toleration for Protestants, even though she was a Catholic, so long as Protestant ministers in turn, practiced religious toleration. Most Protestant ministers in Scotland agreed to this, but John Knox did not. Mary, Queen of Scots, summoned John Knox several times to appear before her in order to work out a peaceful agreement between them. But each time, John Knox argued that no monarch had the right to dictate the interpretation or of the Bible or content of sermons based upon the Bible. So the two were never able to reach an agreement, and the conflict was worsened in 1564 when Knox, now a widower, married one of Mary, Queen of Scots' distant relatives without her royal assent. Finally, in 1567 came Mary, Queen of Scots' abdication, and shortly afterward, Protestantism was firmly established in Scotland. And so this picture is a picture of St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is where John Knox preached. Now, I want to just make one other short note here. You'll notice that the name Edinburgh is not pronounced the way it's spelled. It's spelled Edinburg. So it looks like it should be pronounced Edinburgh, but it's actually pronounced Edinburgh. Okay, so you might want to remember that. Okay, I have some discussion questions for you, and I want to encourage you to think about these discussion questions so that we will be able to have a good discussion during our next class session. So here are 3 questions I want you to think about. Number 1, compare and contrast Luther's Reformation with the English and Scottish Reformation. So in what ways were they similar? And in what ways were they different? And believe it or not, this question is actually a question that is asked in some advanced placement history exams for advanced level history students in high school. So this is a very valid question. Number 2, when is it good to break with authority? And you could also think about the flip side. When is it not good to break with authority? Number 3, what lessons can you learn from the English and Scottish Reformations that will help you in your own life and ministry? Because one of the things we want to do as we study history is we want to see what lessons we can learn from the past that can help us today and in the future. So what lessons can you learn from the English and Scottish Reformation that will help you in your own life and ministry? Okay, that concludes our video lecture on the English and Scottish Reformation. Next, please watch the video on the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and I'll see you in class.